Thank you very much. My name is Gibson Worsham, as Beth said. I'm an architect and an architectural historian based in Richmond, Virginia. Being from Virginia, I didn't know anything about the wonderful resort world of Northern Michigan, but my wife, who's from Louisville, is part of many generations, or numerous generations, who've been coming to Wequetonsing and Harbor Springs for exactly a century, basically, I think, at this point. I've also taken up a tremendous interest in the history of the region and produced a history of Wequetonsing, which was mostly for internal consumption, but there is a copy at the Historical Society and another copy at the Harbor Springs Library. So we don't have very many copies, but those are available for you to peruse if you're interested in seeing that volume. This talk is drawn from that. It goes into much more detail and it's more comprehensive. So what I'm going to do this evening is sort of skim over some of the most interesting features. Beth asked me to talk about cottages, and so I've got that worked in, but I also wanted to sort of introduce the whole idea of Michigan resorts, because I'm also working on a history of the resort associations of Michigan. So that's something I've got in hand. Every summer we go to a different resort. We've really had a lot of fun exploring all around the coastline. So the resorts of Michigan vary greatly in scale and in character, but in general, I sort of see them as an idealized version of an American village. And I'll try to talk a little bit about that and explain why that is. But I'll use the case of Wequetonsing to try to explain how these places came to be and why they all remain objects of unusual architectural and social value. I think they are beautiful places. And they have some lessons for us to learn, I think, about how to organize our lives, even if it isn't in a kind of seasonal manner like these resorts are. The roots of the summer resorts of Northern Michigan are deeply embedded in the great tradition of the camp meeting. They owe their form and their ethos to that tradition, which itself was a response by a growing middle class to the spiritual and social forces that were released by the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening and by the complexity of life that came along with the Industrial Revolution. Many of these camp meetings, as they spread across the country, solidified into seasonal resorts, and the movement spread to every region. One of the very earliest ones, 1869, is the Ocean Grove Camp Meeting in New Jersey. It continues as a Methodist associated camp meeting to this day, and they still have tents, which you see up there in the upper left. Over 100 tents are erected every summer and can be rented at considerable expense, and you have to reserve them years in advance, I think. The land, and this is one of the things we'll be exploring, is how these associations like Wequetonsing are organized. And this, in New Jersey, this association has a thing called ground rent. So you lease your land from the association that owns the entire resort, and then you own your own cottage as actual real estate, which you can transfer to other people using the conventional ways of buying and selling real estate. But you pay ground rent to the association, which takes care of maintains a lot of the city functions. The great grandfather of all of these resorts is the Chautauqua Institution in Chautauqua, New York. And there are hundreds of spin-offs of this across the nation. Wequetonsing is actually one of those spin-offs in a very modest way, but Bayview is our principal Chautauqua resort. There are others in the on the Great Lakes as well, but this is the principal one. And Chautauqua, New York is where this idea of a summer university, a music festival, opera, libraries, book groups, lectures go on a pretty big scale. Also, like Bayview, associated with the Methodist Church. Even the wealthiest of the resorters who came to northern Michigan were led to kind of reenact the simplicity of earlier days. They lived in these plain, diminutive, even toy-like dwellings. They encountered the edges of the wilderness, of the mountains or the sea. Through sport, they reenacted the eternal struggle of mankind with the elements. And you might say that in these forest or seaside landscapes, they hoped in some way, even inarticulately, to regain spiritual health and to escape the ever-present threat of disease, which was palpable in the great Midwestern cities. When coming to the country for these resorters, living in a community remained an essential part of the expectations. And these miniature streets of tents or of cottages were developed as a kind of ideal pastoral village. For just a part of the year, they served as extensions of the great towns and cities of the Midwest. The deep history of the region is associated with the Native American occupation of the area preceding its development in the mid to late 19th century. The resort, known as Wequetonsing, came about as a result of a special combination of timing and geography and historical events that would lead to the founding of more than 50 such resorts in northern Michigan during the 50 years between 1875 and 1925. There are probably well over 100, but in terms of those that survived, still operating today, I haven't got an exact number, but 50 to 60 seems to be the number. Harbor Springs began as a location for tribal councils of the Odawa Indian band that was in this locality. They moved seasonally with the crops and with opportunities for hunting and gathering. The community grew under the protection of the Catholic mission of New Arbor Croche, which was the name of what's now Harbor Springs. Emmett County was opened for homesteading in 1856. This all developed after the Treaty of Washington, which was a disastrous treaty for the native peoples, dated from 1837, in which about 37% of the state of Michigan, that number seems wrong. I think it was more like 87% of the state of Michigan was transferred to the government. Under that terms of that treaty, extensive tracts around the village of Little Traverse, Harbor Springs, were reserved for tribal use for a period of 20 years after the 1856 opening of the region. The opening to white settlement brought with it a complete transformation of the region. For one thing, a vast logging industry grew up, and the railroads were awarded vast tracts of land through the upper Midwest. These railroads were interested in boosting traffic and settlement, and they made possible the development of an industry to replace the timber industry once they had exhausted the forest resources. That new industry was the industry of tourism. By the 1870s, Michigan was ready to become the heart of the Midwestern resort industry. So, spurred by religious fervor and by the commercial acumen of the real estate leaders and religious leaders of the region, as well as the encouragement of the railroad developers, plans were adopted for encouraging the growth of summer places. These were particularly aided by the easy access by rail, which developed during the late 19th century. Of course, the many lakes and the indented shoreline were factors in the attractiveness and appropriateness of the landscape for resorts. There were a lot of enthusiastic real estate promoters, and on the part of the resorters themselves, they felt a need for relief from the summer heat, the hay fever, and the urban squalor of many of the Midwestern cities. There was also a desire on the part of a growing managerial and professional class for a better standard of living, which included a place to send the family in the summer. This had not really been possible before the development of railroads and the increase in income among the middle class. The picture on the right is an early promotion of a summer cottage in northern Michigan from a railroad, Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad's brochure of 1884, entitled "A Happy Summer, Health and Happiness, Fin, Fur, and Feather Found in Northern Michigan." So that's typical of the kinds of intense booster kind of activities that were used to get people's attention and bring them to the north.
Gibson,
Yes.
I'm just going to interrupt really quickly. There's something at the bottom right of your screen, something about an update.
Let me get rid of that. I see it. I didn't know
I
it was
just
there.
noticed it there.
It picks up
Perfect.
occasionally. Yeah, there
Thank
we
you.
go. Sure. So one scheme on the part of these developers was to lay out planned communities at picturesque spots along the shore that had been recently redistributed from the native owners. The resort developers received the land at little or no cost. In fact, the railroads often kicked in capital and attractive perquisites like free transportation of construction materials. In the case of Wequetonsing, there was no cost at all. The land was given to them by the city of, or the town of Harbor Springs. I believe the Harbor Point was purchased at a very low price, and Bayview had been purchased somewhat earlier. Here are though the earliest resorts in Michigan, and you can see that the Little Traverse Bay resorts are the earliest, and they sort of took the lead. So Bayview, 1875, Wequetonsing, 1877, Harbor Point, 1878, and then you have the Charlevoix, Belvedere, and Chicago clubs, and then you move on down the coast to Holland and across to Burt Lake and up to the Straits of Mackinac, and even one resort, which is not specifically a modeled on the camp meeting, it's a forest resort, is the Huron Mountain Club of 1889, a fascinating story there. So Wequetonsing was founded in 1877 as the Presbyterian Summer Resort Association. So it's actually the second resort on Little Traverse Bay after Bayview. It was founded by a group of ministers and laymen from northern Indiana and from lower Michigan. So as with most of the early resorts, the founders were middle managers, bank clerks, attorneys, mostly from lower Michigan, who found it convenient to come up. And they were not intended as ostentatious places for great wealth. That's the cottage. As you see, the cottages are small, the land, the lots are small, and it was intended to be attractive and affordable for middle class and managerial class people. But the resort was reorganized under its present name in 1880, which is the year in which the law under which these resorts exist to this very day was first promulgated. So the resorters often appropriated Ojibwe and even Plains Indian words and place names, including the name that the resort received in 1880, Wequetonsing, which means variously at or on the Little Bay, and that was the name for the place where Harbor Springs is today. As time passed, the membership expanded beyond businessmen, clerks, and lawyers to include prominent industrialists, professionals, and wealthy leaders from across the Midwest and the South as the railroad transportation and steamship transportation expanded and it became more accessible. So these joint stock associations were set up to hold and develop tracts on the waterfront into summer resorts, and they were organized under a specific Michigan resort law. This unique form of landholding was developed to facilitate the development of these resorts, and it still holds today. The lots are leased from the associations by the shareholders in the association. So each holder gets a number of lots, and it's a long-term lease on the lot. And then the cottages are built and held as personal property rather than real estate. Very often in the early days and right on through in the wife's name, because the couple who were moving for the summer, often the husband would stay at home and the wife was there and made the deals. So often these properties are in the wife's name. The resorts were founded in the context of a desire for a better standard of living, I think, is a good way to think of how these were developed. So these resort associations, once they were established and began to attract, we'll see they built a hotel usually to begin to attract people, but they would lay out their grounds in the form of, in two basic ways. One of those forms would be the picturesque, with picturesque drives and curving streets designed to accommodate the lots to an irregular topography. That is the case at Bayview, which we see in the little vignette there in the center. That's an early plat of Bayview, so that everyone was able, they sort of like a giant amphitheater. People are looking out from their lots, at least some of the lots, onto the lake. And now it's so grown up that you don't really see the lake, but originally it must have been much more visible. On the left, you see the Wequetonsing earliest plat, which exists in the Resort Association's record books. These are not recorded at the courthouse; they're recorded through the association. You see that before the railroad came in, it was just a straight line of 5 avenues lined by lots. And these lots were all on there's several terraces at Wequetonsing. So the first terrace is where the beach is, and then you have a intermediate terrace, which is where these cottages were laid out. And then behind that is a bluff. When the railroad came through, they had to chop off some of those lots that hadn't been developed yet, and because the railroad wasn't perfectly straight. And then they added more lots gradually to the rear that go all the way back to the bluff. These narrow lots were gradually filled with small, closely spaced frame cottages, and these cottages are very close together to this day. So you have to be on very good terms with your neighbors in order to keep everybody operating in a happy way. There were, however, changing standards of comfort and scale, and many cottages were enlarged, and others were moved or torn down to make room for much larger cottages. The resort was a quiet, tree-shaded community, and it had a very active social life. But as you can see from this tinted photograph on the right, the landscape was very rough. At all the resorts in northern Michigan, they didn't really have mowing machines, and they didn't have a way to water the grass. So it was essentially dune-like landscape with wildflowers, rough grasses, sand, and in order to get around, they used boardwalks. And because there were no vehicles, particularly people came on train or by boat, the streets were never developed, so they remain to this day just sidewalks. And the railroad track has been replaced by the main road that goes through, so that there's a remarkable kind of pedestrian feel to the place. The trains moved around the bay, and eventually a train called the Northland Limited reached its terminus at Harbor Springs every summer morning, and it stopped at all the resorts and at Wequetonsing's depot, which you see there in that tinted photograph. The train was also known as the Sneezer because of the people fleeing the hay fever in the lower states. And so they all were supposed to be sneezing all the way up here, I guess. A lot of times the train could move very quickly, and it was put together from different cities across the Midwest: Cincinnati, Columbus, Louisville, St. Louis. And the train, they all merged the different cars in northern Indiana, I think at Mishawaka, and then they came on up the to Harbor Springs, all in during the night. So you could you could leave your business on Friday afternoon, get on the sneezer, and be in Harbor Springs at first light in the morning to spend the weekend with your family. These resorts, with their religious original foundation, Wequetonsing was founded as the Presbyterian resort, but the religious connection faded. Unlike at Bayview, the religious connection faded, and new people moved in who weren't connected with the Presbyterian Church. So but certain moral requirements, including no alcohol, no card playing, no dancing, etc., began to fade pretty early on. So early members of the associations seem to be anxious for entertainments, which I would say are on a scale and a schedule that seems way over the top to us today. The amount of partying going on. Organized activities included dances several times a week, seemingly constant formal luncheons with very formal luncheons, and teas, in addition to plays that were put on by members of the associations, concerts, boating on a pretty good size scale, rowing, and lawn sports, including sort of woodland tennis and golf. Pitching quoits was a popular pastime in 1887. It's a wonderful resource which the Petoskey, the Historical Society in Petoskey has, is all the copies of this, the Daily Resorter, which was a newspaper that went on for about 20 years or more, which chronicled the day by day the life of the resorts. So there's a remarkable level of detail there. I was lucky enough to get through all those. I don't believe they're accessible to the public at the moment, but I'm sure they'll eventually be made available. But that was one of the resources that enabled us to understand a lot about this resort particularly. So you see here there's a famous photograph on the left of one of the artesian wells that's been planted with ferns and flowers, and this photograph shows up on a lot of internet searches. It's really quite a remarkable. If you look in the far distant background, you can see the smoke coming up from a steamer, and that, if you can go into this glass plate negative and actually see the boat very clearly if you go to the right version of the photograph. And then you can see the beach even in the early days. This is around 1900. They had a sand brought in, they had a lifeguard, and the children were playing on the beach. That was one of their main activities. The casino, which we'll also see, we'll talk about in a minute, had opened in 1905 with a full program for children and adults, including card parties and dancing lessons. But the 1920s and 30s saw a less active social program. Party giving, dancing, and organized sports of the early part of the century were replaced by a quieter domestic and sporting life in the mid-20th century, focused mostly on golf and tennis. However, in the 1930s and 40s, the children were really needed some sort of form of entertainment. So crafts, arts and crafts, baseball, and sailing were introduced, particularly in the period after World War II, and that program continues to this day. I love the picture of the people sitting on the beach in their full outfits in around 1890 there. This is a picture of the arts and crafts class of 1938. And in the background, you can see the sailboats, the NMs, which were developed at about the same time. And there's a picture of the dock from a swimmer's perspective in the same period, or a little earlier, actually. Now, every resort had to have a hotel, and the Wequetonsing was very quick to build one in 1877 to 1878. It didn't have too many rooms, and according to one account, the bedrooms were only 10 feet square, and the partitions that separated them only extended partway to the ceiling, which I think was not unusual either for hotels, resort hotels at that time. Harbor Point built a hotel the same year, and these hotels were where people came in order to see the resort. I'm sure they were encouraged to purchase shares and to build a cottage, and they were also, people were vetted to see if they were appropriate, the right sort of people, our sort of people, and that hotel continued to serve that purpose for a long time. And here we see a photograph of the hotel. It was expanded twice, even before 1888, and then expanded again. In 1888, it could seat 200 guests at once in the dining hall. But by 1964, it was seen as an outdated liability. The facilities weren't up to standard. And, it was just anybody could come and stay there, So it was demolished in 1964. And the place taken by a park, which is now the croquet courts. Another building, which you might call the main civic building of most of the larger associations, was an assembly hall, or also known as a casino. And the original building, the assembly hall you see here, was built in 1889. It followed one that was built at Harbor Point, and another one built considerably earlier at Bayview. The Bayview one is still standing, and this was modeled directly on that. It looks very similar. You can see an interesting kind of pattern in the up in the gable here, and this wide porch, and then a sort of formal arrangement of trees. So this building was placed at the center line of 2nd Avenue, right beyond the railroad track. So it was placed in a very formal location where and you can see in my map there, I drew on it a square for approximately where that building was located. The association held regular church services there, as well as dances, concerts, and plays. By 1902, that assembly hall wasn't good enough. It was probably too small, and a new building was planned known as the casino. And the word casino, as we know, is used in places like the Vatican to mean little house. It doesn't mean a place for gambling. It's just that gambling often took place in some of the little houses in the European spas. But here, this building was used for social events. It was located even farther back against the bluff at the end of 2nd Avenue, where it stands today in a very dominating position. If you look back when you pass 2nd Avenue, you'll see it there at the center line with an oval gray lawn in front of it. So it remains one of the most architecturally sophisticated buildings at any of the area's resorts. I don't think there's anything quite like it. It's a forceful statement of the association's commitment to elegant entertainment and to first-rate architecture. So I think it was designed by architect A.E. Rose of Petoskey, and actually opened in the season of 1905. It held all the amenities that were in the previous assembly hall, but it included, in addition, in the basement, a bowling alley, as well as card rooms and a children's room. The building was lowered in the 20th century so that it's no longer sitting up on that basement, but so the bowling alley is gone. But inside it has a stage and the sign over the door that says Summer Playhouse at the back of the stage, which is a good metaphor really for all of this summer resort. Someone's running a vacuum cleaner in the background. Is that annoying everybody, or is that not too noticeable?
I don't hear anything.
Good.
If
I
anyone
just
has
wanted
any
to make
problems, put it in the chat, but I just hear you.
Good. I just heard it going there. So the Summer Playhouse is a possible title for a history of the resorts of Michigan, because that's really kind of what we're talking about. So the cottages, now we'll talk a little bit about the cottages, because we've talked about the hotel, we've talked about we haven't really talked about the depot, but that's more than we can get at this evening. But the hotel and the casino are features of most of the larger resorts, and even the smaller ones often have a recreation building of some sort. Cottages responded over time to national trends in domestic architecture. So the first cottages were related to the Carpenter Gothic, or the vernacular or ordinary houses familiar to local builders and to farmers and folks across the Midwest. These designs look very much like what you would see anywhere in Michigan or Indiana or Illinois. Later, the buildings began to be more sophisticated and to mirror types of styles popularized by pattern books and by architectural journals. These include the American four-square and bungalow forms, the colonial revival house types, the prairie school, which we think of the most prominent examples would be Frank Lloyd Wright. And then the most impressive buildings are the work of local architect Earl Mead, who has been the subject of an exhibit at the Historical Society in several years ago. The oldest cottages in Wequetonsing are located along the first block of each of the 5 avenues on the south side of the railway. The lots farther back north of the railway were developed as the section filled up. The lack of any building rules to begin with created inconsistencies and overlapping by buildings of the lot lines. So these inconsistencies and irregularities continue to either plague or amuse the lot holders to this day. There have been all sorts of different kinds of ways of dealing with the fact that people aren't always placed right where they are supposed to be, and they can complicate the plans of the builders and property managers. But eventually, the holders of single lots were not allowed to build a house wider than 28 feet and not closer than 4 feet to the lot lines. So that means that the buildings can be 8 feet apart, and they often are. I should add that building, we don't know where that building is. It says it's in Wequetonsing. It's really one of the plainest cottages up there. It's probably in one of the 2 annexes, which we haven't mentioned, but Wequetonsing proper is about 100 cottages. And then there's an annex at East and West Weque, which are not part of the association. They have another association, but they are owned in fee simple. They're not part of a traditional Michigan resort association. So this may be one of those buildings on a lot, either to the east or west. And then you see here a picture of some of the earliest forms of housing, which were tents. And we've got a number of pictures of people in tents. Presumably they're going to be building a cottage soon, but they've got a tent set up so they can stay on their lot. First period cottages are plainly detailed and simple in form. You know, we noticed that Bayview really has a different and much more exotic architectural collection than some of the other resorts do. The decoration here is limited to sawn ornaments, porch brackets, fanciful porch railings, infills in the gable that are decorative, and often picturesquely shaped windows. Cottages were painted in a full range of earthy sorts of natural colors. They were including dark green, red, and yellow. They weren't by any means all painted white as they mostly are today. This cottage was mentioned in the Daily Resorter, and it was, quote, "One of the handsomest cottages in the grounds is the new one erected last winter," that's 1887, "by L.P. Rowland of Grand Rapids. The windows, which are unusually large, are of fine French plate glass, and the whole cottage is built to correspond." So this was a very impressive cottage in 1887. And you can see that there's the French plate glass window right there. And most of the cottages have a diagonal wall with a plate glass window in it facing towards the water. So that's there for the view. And you'll see those repeatedly in the cottages that are located perpendicular to the water, on lots perpendicular to the water. This cottage is one of my favorites, and it contains a fascinating layered history of alterations over many years. So going through the cottage is like a lesson in the history. It was originally built as a one-story, maybe with a slight attic, which was rented by the hotel. It was part of a hotel across the avenue. And then it was raised to a 1 3/4 story as it is today, and then added on to repeatedly. So it was originally just a simple box shape with the diagonal window, but in 1887 that was the thing. Let's see. This one is no longer standing. It was torn down just the summer before last, and it has the distinction of having been published in the Daily Resorter, a drawing of it published. And there is Dr. E.C. Briggs's cottage at Wequetonsing in 1893. And so that is a kind of a really interesting survival. The first period cottages include some really beautiful ones like the Griswold cottage here from the 1890s, which you can see a historic photograph and a current photograph. It hasn't changed much. You can see the boardwalk in front of it. That's one of my personal favorites. But you can also see from the tinting of the photograph that it was a darker color originally. And then we can look at the next one is was built by F.A. Judd and Son, which were local contractors who were designing and building many of these early cottages. So the drawing does not go with the house because we don't know which house goes with this drawing, but that's a floor plan by F.A. Judd and Son from 1897. And the house was priced at a little more than $700. He provided this pencil sketch, and there's a specification which called for hemlock sills, hemlock studs, and joists to be placed on cedar blocks, which are set into the ground, as are most of the cottages. The older cottages at Wequy are still set on cedar posts in the ground. They don't have foundations. The siding was to be of Norway pine, dressed on the interior with beading to correspond to the ceiling, and also was to be of Norway pine. And the 18-foot walls were to be topped by an 18-inch projecting cornice. So this is pretty much the recipe for the standard early first period cottage. This cottage in the drawing shows a single 12 by 18-foot main room with a small 12 by 14 bedroom opening off of it behind a dogleg stair. The living room projected out to form a bay on the front with that large picture window facing toward the water. And you'll see that also in the Galt cottage to the left. The John P. Hewitt cottage at 44 Beach Drive has the most fanciful sawn gable decoration and barge boards. The porch, I don't believe, is as old as the barge boards. Hewitt was either the brother or a close relative of the president of the Grand Rapids Indiana Railroad, so he got a choice beachfront lot. This happens to be my family's cottage, and we had the opportunity to measure it in detail, so it made a really good subject for study. So the earliest cottages contain the whole history of the resort within their fabric. So it's possible to trace the changes from simple structures that didn't have kitchens or bathrooms to tightly organized sets of specialized rooms, comfortably accommodating not only meals, but also increased privacy and entertaining space for large families, their guests, and housing for 1 or 2 servants. So this cottage was moved from the beachfront back to one of the back lots in order to make way for a fancy cottage. And originally it had a tiny kitchen, which you can see right, right here, that had a little chimney, which was probably a small stove that could be used for making breakfast or something. And then there was a dining room next to that with a swinging door and a slightly larger living room, and then a bedroom behind, which was opened off the living room at the bottom of the stairs. The stairs were so steep, they didn't have a landing at the top. You just stepped off the stairs into the rooms to each side. They didn't give you a place to stand while you were stepping. So later, the building was enlarged, and it was large to accommodate a maid who was located in that former bedroom. The porch had a small servant's bath added to it. A larger kitchen wing with a bedroom above was added so that the area here above could have a bathroom on the second floor. And then a garage and chauffeur's room were added on the very back with a small bathroom for the chauffeur. All that can be traced by looking really closely at the building. Then we get to the second period of cottages. So around beginning in the 1890s, but mostly in the early decades of the 20th century, we begin to see much more sophisticated architecture. And these buildings now, I should have mentioned that the reason that there was no large kitchen, and there were no servants is because everyone was taking their meals at the hotel in the early days. But by this period, people brought their own staff and they had kitchens. The Earl Mead, was capable of a tremendous variety in his architectural designs, and his designs were never solemn, and they even became whimsical at times as variations on the theme of the summer cottage. And these cottages give Wequetonsing and the other local resorts their principal architectural character. We also feel that when we're in Harbor Springs, because many of the buildings in Harbor Springs, the New York and some of the office buildings, the library, were all designed by Earl Mead as well. Earl Mead had an mechanical engineering degree from Michigan State, but he had worked with some prominent architects in other areas and became active here in the late 90s, but he actually moved here from 1902 and lived here until 1936. And as many as 100 cottages in the area were designed by him. So you see here the Maples, which is the last house in Wequetonsing proper on beach, going away from Harbor Springs. And here we were lucky enough to find the actual drawings in Chicago collection. And you can see the complex floor plan, the large staircase, the servants were accommodated in the back, in this back area here, and then an enormous curving porch, so that this cottage is one of the larger and more attractive and quite impressive cottages to this day. Then we have Carousel, which was built for the Scaife family on Beach Drive, and it's one of the resort's most sophisticated turn-of-the-century cottages, one of my favorites. You can see the multi-paned windows on the upper floor, which has been deliberately dropped so to give it a picturesque roof line, this central dormer, and then the pierced frieze around the top of the arched porch, and the change in materials from the lower wall to the upper wall. All of it is designed it's just a very satisfying composition. The other building is the Gilmore Cottage, which is on Fifth Avenue, and you can see there it has a gambrel roof. It's a more complex kind of design, but even there you see the diagonal window because it's looking down the street, down the avenue towards the water. Many of these new cottages, even the smaller ones, took on classical and colonial revival details, shingled upper floors, deep console supporting the roofs, bay windows, arched porches, columns, and like little teeth, dental cornices. But even these grand cottages continued this tradition of exposed, unpainted studs and beaded siding on the interior. So it's literally the back of the weatherboards are beaded, and that's what you see on the inside. And they have taken on a kind of wonderful, warm color through their 120 years of existence, if they haven't been painted. Many of them have been painted, and some have been winterized, but some of the most charming interiors are the sort of grand staircases, but all built out of unpainted basic wood with this kind of beaded finish all around and exposed joists. Even when contrasted with the scale and the colonial revival detailing of these large cottages, this open, lightweight framing underlines the ephemeral character of resort life. Nobody's taking this too seriously, and you certainly can't stay after the weather gets cold or get here too early. Other cottages include the Carew Cottage. The department store tycoon J.T. Carew of Cincinnati built this one on the beach, and he's caricatured here in the local newspaper with his symbol of his busy bee store symbol beside him. This cottage has this great shingled upper floor, these interesting way that the shed roofs fit over the dormer, deep, sorry, I advanced faster than I wanted, deep sawn brackets on the porch, and these interesting square piers. One of the best preserved and most attractive of the cottages. You can also see the characteristic Wequetonsing light fixtures, which have been spreading through the whole region. People seem to like them. You see them in other newer, modern resorts, but this is where they started. The this is the one of the largest and most amazing cottages, also designed by Earl Mead, called Cedarmere on Beach Drive. This is not in Wequetonsing proper, along with Dexter Fairbanks' house, which is a kind of elaborate colonial revival structure worthy to have been built in New England. It has all of the details like the Palladian window and the many different shapes of porches, which we associate with that kind of colonial revival in the late 19th century New England. And then we have the castle, which everybody knows well. Well, the castle has a much more complicated story than people realize. Its original form, it was built by Dr. Barr in the late 19th century. It was a frame cottage with an interesting kind of second floor porch and a Japanese water garden in front with Japanese bridges over it and trees planted, very ornamental grounds. And then you see on the interior here, the craftsman exposed wood interior. And then it gradually got more and more complicated, and this tower and the stone porch were all added around that original cottage to create today's amazing castle, which everybody loves to look at. Meanwhile, in the second period, other cottages continued to be very simply detailed. Not everything was like the cottages down along the waterfront. The Robinson Cottage here facing the railroad was built in 1898. It's still owned by the original family. It's wonderfully furnished on the interior, including Wequetonsing's own privately operated public library, which was maintained by the owner of the cottage. And it has a card catalog and everything, and all the books are still there, all novels, mostly from the early 20th century, as well as, beautiful collections of different things, nice, interesting furniture. So these houses continued that simple styling of the earliest houses and were often built as spec homes by local builders. This is the case here. This cottage at 7 Pennsylvania was sold by a speculator to the current owner's great-great-grandfather, William Robinson. These, however, differed from those early cottages in having greater depth. They were bigger, they had a more rectangular form, and sometimes and often had a hipped roof instead of a gable roof. But they still had that exposed wood interior. Third period cottages that came after those include distinctive bungalows built in the teens and 20s. 5 of these were built by the firm of Rockwell and Bond, and they all had this creosote stained exterior. And the best example is the Richardson Cottage on 2nd Avenue, which is, a great example of a complicated bungalow plan design on a very sophisticated one. And there are a number of those through the association. These are characterized by shallow gables, supported by projecting rafter ends, and they have a marked horizontal emphasis, which you see. All of these were built on undeveloped lots at the back of the resort that were waiting for cottages to be built on them. The gambrel roofed house you see here on the left was built, however, closer to the water on First Avenue for Marion Wetmore Smith about 1938. And this is a classic colonial revival gambrel roof, Dutch colonial, with very loyal to that colonial revival detailing, very, very sophisticated. It looked like a New England farmhouse. The 32 4th Avenue, the Goshorn House, 1924, is like a little suburban house from that period, charming. And then the 56 Beach Drive, the Pillars, is one of everybody's favorites. Also, that's outside of the resort proper, but it's another Earl Mead with a really playful, oversized, colossal columns, and then these little bits of porches stuck between them. It's just very sophisticated design. And then the bluff was developed. The bluff was actually laid out in the early 20th century, and you can see it on this map along the top, the pink. And there you see the picturesque design has begun to appear. Now, these lots are so skinny and wedge-shaped that none of them were actually used as single sites for houses. Almost all the houses occupy 4 lots because they're so tiny. But that Park Place is still there, and the form is still very visible. It sits up on top of the bluff with a beautiful view out over the bay. Sorry, wait a minute. The like so many other cottages, this grand colonial revival Bosworth cottage, which you see on the left, circa 1924, with its 2-story columns, is up on Bluff Walk. It's one of my favorites as well. So the pedestrian landscapes at Michigan resorts made perfect sense to the first lot holders who had no need for automobiles or even carriages, since boats and dummy trains provided easy communication between towns and resorts. So as a result, they constructed these networks of boardwalks and paths. Some of those paths actually extend between resorts like Roaring Brook and Wequetonsing. There are little pathways that extend through the woods. They made walking and communication and visiting easy. And then a kind of communal decision-making assured that almost everyone had equal access to the amenities, most importantly, the view. This was achieved by careful planning, whether as at the point hugging the hills with curving lanes, or at Bayview, or as at Wequetonsing, sharing the view from lots arranged along streets that ran back perpendicularly from the shore. So just to kind of sum it all up, the neat arrangements of tightly spaced cottages, the shared views, and the close-knit family friendships, and I must say rivalries, make even the most informally operated of the associations like Wequetonsing seem very different from the world outside their boundaries. Wequetonsing remains an example of unusual architectural and social value. So now I think we can go to some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. That was lovely. I know that a lot of the architecture buffs in this chat must have been very excited to see all those pictures. I know I was. So there are a few questions down in the chat, but I'm going to give people some time to go ahead and type them out if they haven't yet. One of them that I saw, and I did want to answer, actually, I put the answer in the chat, but the Daily Resorter newspapers, those are fabulous. We have some at the museum here in Harbor Springs, and Greenwood Cemetery in Petoskey, as part of their digitization project, they have something like 30,000 newspapers digitized now, including the Daily Resorters. And they are keyword searchable on their website. They are fantastic.
Thank you for letting me know. I had to go through the the original
I bet that was
in order
to. More work.
It was a lot of work. Yeah.
We have a question about when was the railroad line removed? The one in Weequay there.
It's the same period as the hotel, early 1960s. There are plenty of people who remember placing pennies, on the railroad tracks and so forth. But those were freight trains. The passenger trains ended a little before that in the 50s.
Yeah, I know in downtown Harbor Springs, the Grand Rapids in Indiana, the main line was in the 60s as well. So I thought it was probably fairly similar.
I think it was the Pennsylvania by that point. It was called the
Yeah, you're
Pennsylvania
right.
Railroad,
You're
which
right.
is why we have Pennsylvania Avenue in at Wequetonsing running along the track route.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's see here. Sybil wanted you to say again, just when typically was the bluff housing built? I think she means like the furthest.
Yes, the housing up on the bluff was built. Frankly, I don't remember the exact date that those were laid out, but a lot of improvements were made around 1902, including the office building that's there. The depot was rebuilt at one point in the early 20th century. The casino was built, and I think they laid out Central Avenue, which is at the bottom of the bluff, and the bluff itself in about that period. And they also replaced the boardwalks with the same concrete that's there today. It's a very well preserved, and they that was when they put in the sewer system and the water mains, which I have if you're interested, I have a brief story about that, which is little known, and that is that there was a serious disease outbreak that came from the water in at the Colonial Inn, which was at that time its own little resort. And it was essentially, they said it was at Wequetonsing because that's where that is. And what happened was everything was great before they put in the sewer system, and they had a spring, a artesian well where they washed all the lettuce and fruits and vegetables for the hotel dining room. But the new sewer system had a leak in it, and it got into that water. And so there were no deaths, but there's an article in the Chicago Journal which talks about the detective work that was done to figure out where the problem came from. No one really knew the source. It could have been the milk or the lake or the water supply. So figuring that out, I think only one person died, and I figured that out from reading the diaries of one of the families from St. Louis, and she died, a young woman, well after they went home, so it didn't make it into the journal article.
Good gracious, that's not very pleasant.
That's the worst thing that, from a publicity standpoint, that you could possibly have happen in Harbor Springs.
Yes, I think so. I agree.
But they survived it. That was about 1902, 1903. They hushed it up, I imagine.
I imagine, yeah. Now I have something to look for in those daily resorter newspapers. Let's see here. Do you know who the architect was of the castle of Dr. Barr's?
That was Earl Mead.
Was it Mead? Okay.
Yeah. The way we know what Earl Mead did, we don't have a list, but there is a collection of postcards at the Harbor Springs Library, which is kept in notebooks, and the buildings that he designed are in that's his collection. And so finding a picture of a building in there is a way of identifying it as his work. Now, I figured out that was Mead. I'm not positive that's why, but with, let's say, the other house I showed you, I'm trying to say the name of it. One of the owners sent me a letter, saying, "How do you know my house was designed by Earl Mead?" And I said, "Well, it's in this." I was able to send him a Xerox from this collection at the Harbor Springs Library.
Sure, that's lovely.
There was also a book which I think you all should get involved in at the Historical Society. There's a book which he planned and never published called Resorts of the Midwest. And I'll send you a reference to where it is. It's in Chicago, and it could just probably, I've never seen it, but I imagine it could be published. And it's all of his designs.
Very cool. Pardon me there, I had a little cough. That would be very cool to see. Let me see here. Are walking tours of Wequet ever offered? I don't think the Wequetonsing Association offers those. I don't know if they'd be open to allowing those by a third party. That's a good question. We aren't currently hosting any.
I think as long as you stick on the sidewalk along the beach, or even Long Beach Drive, that's public property, and you can see most everything. Or go and then turn and go back down Pennsylvania, and you've seen the whole place. So,
Right. So,
and
uh,
it's a case that you might be able to make as a historical society. You might, ask.
yes, well, so before my time, I've been here 10 years now. Before my time, there were some home tours that we had organized quite a long time ago, but perhaps that's something.
And East and West Week is where the really grand houses are, and you can just approach the property owners individually, and many of them are very interested in, I'm sure they're not wouldn't mind. Just like Harbor Point allows people to come out at certain times.
They do, yes. And let me see. Matthew would like to know what your wife's maiden name was.
Her name is
Schneider.
Schneider. They're from St. Matthews in Louisville.
Okay. Maybe you guys have a connection there in common. The photo behind me is from, that photo. Hold on. I'm fairly certain I'm going to say it wrong if I don't open it. Let me look it up. 1887. 1887. Let me see which way I can move. There. And then behind me, that very large 4-story building right there is the Kensington Hotel, and that burned down a couple of years later. So that's how we can date this picture. Tours offered of Harbor Point. The tours on Harbor Point that the Historical Society hosts about every 3 years, the Harbor Point Association and their Lighthouse Committee are kind enough to allow us to host public tours of the Little Traverse Lighthouse, but certainly not of the homes.
But you have to get to the lighthouse.
We do, yes. We bus you out there. Yes, we do.
Right.
So,
I noticed there's a question about McGoodwin.
Yes.
That was my wife's great uncle, and he's from Kentucky. His name was Thomas Quigley McGoodwin. And I don't know too much about his background, but he married my wife's aunt, and one of his relatives still lives at Wequetonsing also. There's more than one connection there.
Religious influence anymore? Is there any religious influence, and when did that change?
Well, it's interesting that Wequetonsing was a Presbyterian organization, but the famous bishop from Missouri, Episcopal bishop, moved there, and he was the one who conducted many of the religious services and also officiated at the blessing of the golf clubs or whatever they had up at the golf course. And he also handed out the awards at the the sports contest. Was a very beloved figure. So that probably dwindled. I'm sure they had hymn books and a piano and well into the teens and 20s, but it was not emphasized. Whereas if you go to the Chicago Club or down to some of the other resorts we visited, including the Sequanota Club, which is on Lake Charlevoix, they still have hymn sings and a religious connection, even though they're not officially associated with any religious organization.
That makes a lot of sense. Let me go back through the chat just quickly to make sure I didn't miss anything. There's a message to you, Gibson, from Tom and Margie. They missed you. They see you in Richmond.
Yes, that's nice.
Architect of the castle. I think that might have been it. If no one has any other questions, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to type frantically into the chat. If you do, we are going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much for doing this and for joining us this evening, Gibson. It was wonderful. And thank you to we had 119 on this Zoom at one point. So that's quite a lot of people tuning in. We sincerely appreciate your participation in programs like this and supporting the Historical Society.